And I'll make that the hour. So, hello to anyone who is here, which as always I never know if there is anyone here. This time that's true because no one said anything. But for anyone who is here and who is not familiar with me, hello, my name is SkitterSkreetch. You can call me Skitter, and I am a rat trapped inside the... Oh, no, that's the wrong one. This library. This being a fragment, of course, of the greater library in which I am still trapped. Aslam, he makes me read books, which is what I do while I'm in this library, and what I intend to be doing for you today. Specifically today we're going to be reading a book that Lampers pressed me to read, which was Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Now I'm not currently over by that, because, let's call it, Lamp only has these little cameras up in specific locations, so we're going to have to move while I'm over here. There we are. There we are. Here's the book in question. So this is our little Kafka section, and that first one there is Metamorphosis. We've got a few of his. We've got a little set of them here, and yeah, these are, well, at least Metamorphosis is reasonably long, so the plan is to hopefully just read through that one today, and hopefully that will sort of last us a good amount of time until, you know, such a point as well, the story is done basically. But I don't think there's too much going on yet, so yeah, just going to read that one today. Hopefully things will hold up alright and we won't have a crash like we did yesterday, but if we do, then I guess we do, and we'll see how we go from there. But yeah, as always, if at any point you've missed something that I've said, or I've gone too fast, or I've stumbled over something and you need me to go back, let me know, and I'm happy to do that. If you have questions, thoughts, or comments as we're going through, let me know. This one's fairly long, so I'll probably pause at a couple of points to have a drink of water and give some thoughts, and then I'll do my big roundup at the end. Other than that, I don't think there's too much to say. But yeah. Oh, I should once again be promoting this Sunday. I'm hosting a theatre troupe, or a theatre night, or something like that, with some other people. So if you want to come to that, that would be good. Oh, and next Tuesday also we're doing, I think I'm going to call them Torrid Tuesdays, where chat gets to choose what I read. But yeah, other than that, I don't think I've got anything else to mention, or that's worth mentioning, so without further ado, I shall get started. Metamorphosis. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from an uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. He would lie on his hard, as it were, arm-plated back, and when he lifted his head a little, he could see his dome-like brown belly divided into stiff arched segments, on top of which the bedquilt could hardly keep in position and were about to slide off completely. His numerous legs, which were pitifully thin compared to the rest of his bulk, waved helplessly before his eyes. What has happened to me? He thought. It was no dream. His room, a regular human bedroom, only rather too small, lay quiet between the four familiar walls. Above the table, on which a collection of cloth samples were unpacked and spread out, Samsa were a commercial traveller, hung the picture which he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and put into a pretty gilt flame. It showed a lady with a fur cap on and fur stole, sitting upright and holding out to the spectator a huge fur muff in which the whole of her forearm had vanished. Gregor's eyes turned next to the window, and the overcast sky, one could hear raindrops beating on the window gutter, made him quite melancholy. What about sleeping a little longer, and forgetting all this nonsense, he thought. But it could not be done, for he was accustomed to sleep on his right side, and in his present condition he could not turn himself over. However violently he forced himself towards his right side, he always rolled onto his back again. He tried it at least 100 times, shutting his eyes to keep from seeing his struggling legs, and only desisted when he began to feel in his side a faint dull ache he had never experienced before. Oh God, he thought, what an exhausting job I've picked on, travelling about day in day out. It's much more irritating work than doing the actual business in the warehouse. And on top of that, there's the trouble of constant travelling and worrying about train connections, the bed and the regular meals, casual acquaintances that are always new and never become intimate friends. The devil take it all. He felt a slight itching up on his belly, slowly pushed himself on his back nearer the top of the bed so that he could lift the head more easily, identified the itching place, which was surrounded by many small white spots, the nature of which he could not understand, made a touch it with a leg, but drew the leg back immediately. The contact made a cold shiver run through him. He slid down again into his former position. This getting up early, he thought, makes one quite stupid. A man needs his sleep. Other commercial laughs, like Iron Woman. For instance, when I come back to the hotel of a morning and write up the orders I've got, these others are only sitting down at breakfast. Let me just try that on with my chief. I'd be sacked on the spot. Anyhow, that might be quite a good thing for me. Who can tell? If I didn't have to hold my hand because of my parents, I'd have given notice long ago. I'd have gone to the chief and told him exactly what I think of him. That would knock him ways from his desk. It's a queer way of acting too, is sitting on a desk and talking down on employees, especially when they have to come quite near, because the chief is hard of hearing. But there's still hope. Once I've saved enough money to pay back my parents' debts to him, that should take another 5 or 6 years, I'll do it without fail. I'll cut myself completely loose then. For the moment though, I'd better get up since my train goes at 5. He looked at the alarm clock ticking on the chest. Heavenly Father, he thought. It was 6:30 and the hands were quietly moving on. It was even half past the hour. It had gone on for 6:45. Had the alarm clock not gone off? From the bed one could see that it had been properly set for 4 o'clock. Of course it must have gone off, yes. It was possible that he slept quietly through that ear-splitting noise. Well, he had not slept quietly. Apparently all the more soundly for that. What was he to do now? The next train were at 7 o'clock. Against that he would need to wire up like mad, and his samples weren't even packed up, and he himself wasn't feeling particularly fresh and active. And even if he did catch the train, it wouldn't avoid a row with the chief, since the warehouse porter would have been waiting for the 5 o'clock train, would have long since reported his failure to turn up. The porter were a creature of the chief's, spineless and stupid. Well, supposing he would have said he was sick. That would be most unpleasant and would look suspicious, since during his 5 years' employment he had not been ill once. The chief himself would be sure to come with the sickness insurance doctor, would reproach his parents for their son's laziness, would cut all excuses short by referring to the insurance doctor, who of course regarded all mankind as perfectly healthy malingerers. And would he be so far wrong on this occasion? Gregor really felt quite well, apart from a drowsiness that rightly superfluous after such a long sleep. They were even unusually hungry. As all this were running through his mind at top speed, without his being able to decide to leave his bed, the alarm clock had just struck 7:15. There came a cautious tap at the door behind the head of his bed. "Gregor," said a voice that was his mother's. "It's 7:15. Haven't you a train to catch?" That gentle voice. Gregor had a shock as he heard his own voice answering ours, unmistakably his own voice, it was true, with a persistent, horrible twittering squeak behind it, like an undertone, that left the words in their clear shape only for the first moment, and then rose up reverberating round them and destroyed their sense, so that one could not be sure they had heard them rightly. Gregor wanted to answer at length and explain everything, but in the circumstances he confined himself to saying, Yes, thank you, Mother. I'm getting up now." The wooden door between them must have kept the change in his voice from being noticeable outside, for his mother contented herself with this statement and shuffled away. This brief exchange of words had made the other member of the family aware that Gregor was still in the house, and they had not expected, and one of the side doors his father was already knocking gently, yet with his fist. Gregor, he called. "What's the matter with you?" And after a little while he called again in a deeper voice, Gregor. The other side door his sister was saying in a low plaintive tone, "Gregor, aren't you well? Are you needing anything?" He answered them both at once. "I'm just ready." He did his best to make his voice sound normal as possible by enunciating the words very clearly, and leaving long pauses between them. So his father went back to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door, do." However, he was not thinking of opening the door, and felt thankful for the prudent habit he had acquired of travelling and locking all doors during the night, even at home. His immediate intention was to get up quietly without being disturbed, to put on his clothes, and above all, to eat his breakfast, and only then to consider what else was to be done, since in bed, he was well aware, his meditations would come to no sensible conclusion. He remembered that often in bed he had felt small aches and pains, probably caused by awkward postures, which would prove poorly imaginary once he got up, and he looked forward eagerly to seeing this morning's delusion gradually fade away. That the change in his voice were nothing but the precursor of a severe chill, a standing ailment of commercial travellers, he had not the least possible doubt. To get rid of the quilt was quite easy. He had only to inflate himself a little, and it fell off by itself. But the next move was difficult, especially because it was so uncommonly broad. He would have needed arms and hands to hoist himself up. Instead, he had only the numerous little legs which never stopped waving in all directions, and which he could not control in the least. When he tried to bend one of them, it was first to stretch itself straight. And did he succeed at making it do what it wanted, all the other legs meanwhile waved them more wildly in an high degree of unpleasant agitation. What's the use of lying idle in bed, said Gregor to himself. He thought he might get out of bed with the lower part of his body first, but this lower part, which he had not yet seen and which he could form no clear conception, proved too difficult to move. It shifted so slowly. When finally, almost with annoyance, he gathered his forelegs together and thrust out recklessly, he miscalculated the direction and bumped heavily against the lower end of the bed, and the sting and pain he felt informed him that precisely this lower part of his body was at the moment probably the most sensitive. So he tried to get the top part of himself out first, and cautiously moved his head up towards the edge of the bed. That proved easy enough, and despite the breadth and mass of the bulk of his body, despite its breadth and mass, the bulk of his body at last slowly followed the movement of his head. Still, when he finally got his head free over the edge of the bed, he felt too scared to go on advancing, for after all, if he let himself fall this way, it would take a miracle to keep his head from being injured. And at all costs he must not lose consciousness now, precisely now. He would rather stay in bed. But when after a repetition of the same effort he lay in his former position again, sighing, and watched his little legs struggling against each other more wildly than ever, if that were possible, he saw no way of bringing any order into this arbitrary confusion. He told himself again that it was impossible to stay in bed, and the most sensible course was to risk everything for the smallest hope of getting away from it. At the same time, he did not forget, meanwhile, to remind himself that cool reflection, cool as possible, were much better than desperate resolves. In such moments, he focused his eyes as sharply as possible on the window, but unfortunately, the prospect of the morning fog, which muffled even the other side of the narrow street, brought him little encouragement and comfort. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself when the alarm clock chimed again. 7 o'clock already, in such a thick fog. And for a little while he lay quiet, breathing lightly, as if perhaps expecting such a complete repose to restore all things to their real and normal condition. But then he said to himself, before it strikes 7:15, I must be quite out of this bed and without fail. Anyhow, by that time someone will have come from the warehouse to ask for me, since it opens before 7. And he set himself to rocking his whole body at once in a regular rhythm, with the idea of swinging it out of the bed. If he tipped himself out in that way, he could keep his head from injury by lifting it at an acute angle when he fell. His back seemed to be hard, and he were not likely to suffer from a fall on the carpet. His biggest worry was the loud crash he would not be able to help making, which would probably cause anxiety, if not terror, behind all the doors. Still, he must take the risk. When he were already half out of the bed, the new method was more a game than effort, for he needed only to hitch himself across by rocking to and fro. It struck him how simple it would be if he could get out. 2 strong people, he thought, with his father and the servant girl, would be amply sufficient. They would only have to thrust their arms under his convex back, lever him out of bed, bend down with their burden, and then be patient enough to let him turn himself right over onto the floor. Hey Naska, day's going pretty good overall. Lamp's still burning an excess of oil, so it's very warm, but yeah, it's going pretty good overall. We're doing Metamorphosis by Kafka tonight. If you want, I can go back to the start, or I can give you a little summary of what we've done so far. All going well so far. Cool. Well, so far, what has happened? So far, we have had Gregor Samsa awaken in his bed to find that he has turned into some sort of large insect. At which point, he has reflected on how this is going to affect his day. That he's overslept, the dislike he has for his work as a travelling salesman, the debt that his parents are in to his boss, which is why he has not yet quit. The fact that he's now missed the second train, even after the first train he was meant to take, and he hasn't packed his samples away. And he's now coming to deal with the realities of getting out of bed while being some sort of, I think, giant roach. And that's where we're in at the middle of it at the minute. And his family started asking about him, though he's locked all of his doors as a sort of an habit he's picked up as a travelling salesman. But yeah. Well, it's not ideal, but you know, you can't call a day bad till it's over. You never know, maybe things will all work out. When they were already half out of the bed, the new method was more a game than effort, for he needed to hitch himself across by rocking to and fro. It struck him how simple it would be if he could get out. 2 strong people, he thought of his father and the servant girl, would be amply sufficient. They would only have to thrust their arms under his convict back, lever him out of the bed, bend down with their burden, and then be patient enough to let him turn himself right over onto the floor. For it was to be hoped his legs would then find the proper functioning. Well, ignoring the fact that the doors were all locked, all he really called for out. In spite of his misery, he could not suppress a smile at the very idea of it. He got so far that he could barely keep his equilibrium when he rocked himself strongly, and would have to nerve himself very soon for the final distance, since in 5 minutes' time it would be the 7:15, when from the front door bell rang. "That's someone from the warehouse," he said to himself, and grew almost rigid, while his little legs only jigged about all the faster. For a moment, everything stayed quiet. "They're not going to open the door," said Gregor to himself, catching at some kind of irrational hope. But then, of course, the servant girl went as usual to the door with her heavy tread and opened it. Gregor needed only to hear the first "good morning" of the visitor to know immediately who it was. The chief clerk himself. What a fate to be condemned to work for him first when the smallest omission at once gave rise to the gravest suspicion. We're all employees in a body nothing but scoundrels, but there are not among them one single loyal devoted man who, though he might have wasted an hour or so of the firm's time in a morning, were not tormented by consciences to be driven out of his mind, actually incapable of leaving bed. Would it really have been sufficient to send an apprentice to inquire, if any inquiry were necessary at all? Did the chief clerk himself have to come, and thus indicate to the entire family, an innocent family, that this suspicious circumstance could be investigated by no one less versed in the affairs than himself? And more through the agitation caused by these realizations than through any act of will, Gregor swung himself out of bed with all his strength. There were a loud thump, but they were not really a crash. His fall were broken to some extent by the carpet. His back, too, were less stiff than he thought, and so they were merely a dull thud, not so very startling. Only he had not lifted his head carefully enough, and to hear it, he turned it and rubbed it against the carpet in pain and irritation. "There was something falling down in there," said the chief clerk in the next room on the left. Gregor tried to suppose to himself that something like what had happened to him today might some day happen to the chief clerk. One really could not deny that it was possible, but as if in brusque reply to this supposition, the chief clerk took a couple of firm steps in the next door room, and his patent leather boots creaked. The right-hand room, his sister was whispering to inform him of the situation. "Gregor, the chief's here." "I know," muttered Gregor to himself. He didn't dare to make his voice loud enough for his sister to hear it. "Gregor," it was his father now from the left-hand room, "the chief clerk has come and wants to know why you didn't catch the early train. We don't know what to say to him. Besides, he wants to talk to you in person, so open the door, please. It'll be good enough to excuse the untidiness of your room." "Good morning, Mr. Sampson," the chief clerk would call amiably meanwhile. "He's not well," said his mother to the visitor, while his father was still speaking through the door. "He's not well, sir, believe me. What else would make him miss a train? The boy thinks about nothing but his work. Makes me almost cross the way he never goes out in the evenings. He's been here the last 8 days and has stayed at home every single evening. He just sits there quietly at the table reading a newspaper or looking through the railway timetables. The only amusement he gets is doing fret work. For instance, he spent 2 or 3 evenings cutting out a little picture frame. You'd be surprised to see how pretty it is. It's hanging in his room, and you'll see it in a minute when Gregor opens the door. I must say I'm glad you've come, sir. We should never have got him to unlock the door by ourselves. He's so obstinate. And I'm sure he's unwell, though he wouldn't have it to be so this morning." "I'm just coming," said Gregor slowly and carefully, not moving an inch for fear of losing his one word of the conversation. "I can't think of any other explanation now," said the chief clerk. "I hope it's nothing serious. Although on the other hand, I must say that we men of business, fortunately or unfortunately, very often simply have to ignore any slight indisposition, since business must be attended to." "Well, can the chief clerk come in now?" asked Gregor's father impatiently, again knocking on the door. "No," said Gregor. In the left-hand room, a painful silence followed this refusal. In the right-hand room, his sister began to sob. Why didn't his sister join the others? She was probably nearly out of bed and hadn't even begun to put on her clothes yet. Well, why was she crying? Because he wouldn't get up and let the chief clerk in? Because he were in danger of losing his job? And because the chief would begin dunning his parents again for the old debts? Surely there were things one didn't need to worry about for the present. Gregor was still at home and not in the least thinking of deserting the family. At the moment, true, were lying out on the carpet, and no one who knew the condition he were in could seriously expect him to admit the chief clerk. But for such a small discourtesy, which could plausibly be explained away somehow later on, Gregor could hardly be dismissed on the spot. It seemed to Gregor that it would be much more sensible to leave him in peace for the present than to trouble him with tears and entreaties. Still, of course, their uncertainty bewildered them all, and excused their behaviour. "Mr. Sampson," the chief clerk called it, now in a louder voice, "what's the matter with you? Here, are you barricading yourself in your room, giving only yes and no for answers? Causing your parents a lot of unnecessary trouble and neglecting, I mention this only in passing, neglecting your business duties to an incredible fashion. I am speaking here in the name of your parents and your chief, and I beg you quite seriously to give me immediate and precise explanation. You amaze me. You amaze me. I thought you were a quiet, dependable person, and now all at once you seem bent on making a disgraceful exhibition of yourself. The chief did hint to me early this morning a possible explanation for your disappearance, with reference to the cash payments that were entrusted to you recently, but I almost pledged my solemn word of honour that this could not be so. Now that I see how incredibly obstinate you are, I no longer have the slightest desire to take you apart at all. And your position in the firm is not so unassailable. I came with the intention of telling you all this in private, but since you are wasting my time so needlessly, I don't see why your parents shouldn't be here too. For some time past, your work has been most unsatisfactory. This is not the season of the year for a business boom, of course, we admit that, but a season of the year for doing no business at all, that does not exist, Mr. Sampson, must not exist. But sir, cried Gregor, beside himself in his agitation, forgetting everything else, I'm just going to open the door this very minute. A slight illness, an attack of giddiness, has kept me from getting up. I'm still laying in bed, but I feel alright again. I'm getting out of bed now. Just give me a moment or two longer. I'm not quite so well as I thought, but I'm alright. Really. How a thing like that can suddenly strike one down, huh? Only last night I was quite well, my parents could tell you, or rather I did have a slight presentiment. I must have showed some sign of it. Why didn't I report it at the warehouse? One always thinks that an indisposition can be got over without staying in the house. I so do spare my parents. All that you're approaching me with now has no foundation. No one has ever said a word to me about it. Perhaps you haven't looked at the last orders I sent in. Anyhow, I can still catch the 8 o'clock train. I'm much the better for my few hours' rest. Don't let me detain you here, sir. I'll be attending to business very soon, and do good enough to tell the chief so, and make my excuses to him. While all this was tumbling out, pell-mell, and Gregor hardly knew what he was saying, he had reached the chest quite easily, perhaps because of the practice he had in bed, and was now trying to lever himself upright by means of it. He meant actually to open the door, actually to show himself and speak to the chief clerk. He was eager to find out what the others, after all their insistences, would say at the sight of him. If they were horrified, then the responsibility were no longer his, and he could stay quiet. If they took it calmly, then he had no reason either to be upset, and could really get to the station for the 8 o'clock train if he hurried. At first he slipped down a few times from the polished surface of the chest, but at length, for the last heave, he stood upright. He paid no more attention to the pains in the lower part of his body. Over they started. Then he let himself fall against the back of a nearby chair and clung with his little legs to the edges of it. That brought him into control of himself again, and he stopped speaking for now. He could listen to what the chief clerk was saying. "Did you understand a word of it?" the chief clerk were asking. "Surely he can't be trying to make fools of us." "Oh dear," cried his mother in tears. "Perhaps he is terribly ill and we're tormenting him." "Grete, Grete," she called out then. "Yes, mother?" called his sister from the other side. They were calling to each other across Gregor's room. "You must go this minute for the doctor. Gregor is ill. Go for the doctor quick. Did you hear how he was speaking?" That was no human voice, said the chief clerk, and a voice noticeably low beside the shrilling of the mother's. "Anna! Anna!" his father were calling from the hall to the kitchen, clapping his hands. "Get a locksmith at once." And the two girls were already running through the hall with a swish of skirts. How could his sister have got dressed so quickly? And were tearing the front door open. There were no sound of its closing again. They had evidently left it open, as one does in houses where some great misfortune has happened. But Gregor were now much calmer. The words he uttered were no longer understandable, apparently, although they seemed clear enough to him, even clearer than before, perhaps, because his ear had grown accustomed to the sound of them. Yet at any rate, people now believed that something was wrong with him, and were ready to help him. The positive certainty with which these first measures had been taken comforted him. He felt himself drawn once more into the human circle, and hoped for great and remarkable results from both the doctor and the locksmith, without really distinguishing precisely between them. To make his voice as clear as possible for the decisive conversation that was now imminent, he coughed a little, as quietly as he could, of course, since the noise too might not sound like a human cough for all he was able to judge. In the next room, meanwhile, there was complete silence. Perhaps his parents were sitting at the table with the chief clerk, whispering. Perhaps they were all leaning against the door and listening. Slowly, Gregor pushed the chair towards the drawer and let go of it, caught hold of the door for support, the soles of the end of his little legs were somewhat sticky, and rested against it for a moment after his efforts. Then he set himself to turning the key in the lock with his mouth. It seemed, unhappily, that he hadn't really any teeth. What could he grip the key with? On the other hand, his jaws were certainly very strong. With their help, he did manage to set the key in motion, heedless of the fact that he were undoubtedly damaging them somewhere, since a brown fluid issued from his mouth, flowed over the key and dripped on the floor. "Just listen to that," said the chief clerk next door. "He's turning the key." They were great encouragement to Gregor, but they should all have shouted encouragement to him, his father and mother too. Go on, Gregor, they should have called out. Keep going, hold on to the key. And in the belief they were following his effort intently, he clenched his jaws recklessly on the key with all the force of his command. When the turn of the key progressed, he circled around the lock, holding on now with only his mouth, pushing on the key as required or pulling it down again with all the weight of his body. The louder click of the finally yielding lock literally quickened Gregor. With a deep breath of relief, he said to himself, "So I didn't need the locksmith." He laid his head on the handle to open the door. Since he had to pull the door towards him, he was still invisible when it was really wide open. He had to edge himself slowly around the near half of the double door, and do it very carefully if he would not to fall plump upon his back, just on the threshold. He was still carrying out the difficult manoeuvre, with no one there to observe anything else, when he heard the chief clerk utter aloud, "Ah!" It sounded like a gust of wind, and now I could see the man standing as he was nearest to the door, clapping one hand before his open mouth and slowly backing away, as if driven by some invisible steady pressure. His mother, in spite of the chief clerk's being there, her hair was still undone and sticking up in all directions. First class. "Hey, Tanner! Well, I might not be a moth, my good friend, but today we're reading a story about a bug, a very large bug. So you're not entirely out of luck. We're doing Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Good to have you. You want a little, what you got, recap of where we are? Or, you're probably a bit far in for a full restart, but I'll give you a little thing, mate. So, what have we seen? So, Gregor Samsa, travelling salesman, works for a company, or specifically for a man who his parents owe debts to, so he can't quit even though he doesn't like it. He is woken up to find himself some sort of giant insect. And after struggling to get out of bed for a while, realised he's missed his train and slept through his alarm. And he hasn't even packed away his travelling samples yet, and he's really caused a bit of an affray. And his family is worrying why he's running late, and the chief clerk of his warehouse comes to see why he's late. And as he struggles out of bed, trying to get the door open, and people come to understand that he's sick, send for a doctor and a locksmith to get the door in. And he's just managed to open the door by turning the key with his mouth and get it open. And I think he's just been noticed for the first time, which is where we're at. So, yeah. But yeah, good to have you here, Tanner. Appreciate it. He was still carrying out this difficult manoeuvre with no time to observe anything else when he heard the chief clerk utter aloud, "Ah!" It sounded like a gust of wind. And now I could see the man standing as he was nearest to the door, clapping one hand before his open mouth and slowly backing away as if driven by some invisible steady pressure. His mother, in spite of the chief clerk's being there, her hair was still undone and sticking up all directions, first clasped her hands and looked at his father, and then took 2 steps towards Gregor and fell on the floor among her outspread skirts, her face quite hidden on her breast. His father knotted his fist with a fierce expression on his face as if he meant to knock Gregor back into his room, then looked uncertainly around the living room, covered his eyes with his hands, and wept till his great chest heaved. Gregor did not go now into the living room, but leaned against the inside of the firmly shut wing of the door, so that only half his body was visible, and his head above it, bending sideways to look at the others. The light had meanwhile strengthened. On the other side of the street one could see clearly a section of the endlessly long, dark grey building opposite. It was an hospital, abruptly punctuated by its row of regular windows. The rain was still falling, but only in large, singly discernible and literally singly splashing drops.
The rat!
Abbe, good to have you. We're doing Kafka. Gregor Samsa, travelling salesman, woken up to be a big bug, realised he missed his train. Oh, Matt, 10 streams straight. That is remarkable. Thank you very kindly, Abbe. Yeah, so Gregor Samsa, travelling salesman, missed his train, hasn't packed away his samples, has turned into a giant insect in the night. Very worried about getting to his work. He works for a man who his parents owe debts to, and he can't quit despite hating his job. And now the chief clerk has turned up to see why he's late, and he's just managed to get the door open through great effort. And someone sent him a doctor for him. Yeah. And he's just opened the door to his room, so he's seeing the family for the first time, and they're seeing him. The breakfast dishes were set out on the table lavishly, for breakfast was the most important meal of the day to Gregor's father, who lingered it out for hours over various newspapers. Right opposite Gregor on the wall hung a photograph of himself on military service as a lieutenant, and on sword a carefree smile on his face, inviting one to respect his uniform and military bearing. The door leading to the hall were open, and one could see that the front door stood open too, showing the landing beyond and the beginning of the stairs going down. "Well," said Gregor, knowing perfectly well that you were the only one who retained any composure, I'll put my clothes on at once, pack up my samples and start off. Will you only let me go? You see, sir, I'm not obstinate, and I'm willing to work. Travelling is a hard life, sir, but I couldn't live without it. Where are you going, sir? The office? Yes, will you give a true account of all this? I'm going to be temporarily incapacitated. That's just a moment for remembering former services. And bearing in mind that later on, when the incapacity has been got over, one will certainly work with all the more industry and concentration. I'm loyally bound to serve the chief, you know that very well. Besides, I have to provide for my parents and my sister. I'm in great difficulties, but I'll get out of them again. Don't make things any worse than they are, sir. Stand up for me in the firm. Travellers are not popular there, I know. People think them slack. They earn sacks of money and just have a good time. A prejudice is no particular reason for revising. You, sir, you have a more comprehensive view of affairs. A more comprehensive view than the chief himself, who, being the owner, lets his judgment easily be swayed against one of his employees. You know very well that a traveller is never seen in the office almost the whole year round, can so easily fall victim to gossip and ill luck and unfounded complaints, which he mostly knows nothing about, except when he comes back exhausted from his rounds, and only then suffers in person from the evil consequence, which he can no longer trace back to the original causes. Sir, don't go away without a word to me to show that you think me right, at least to some extent, sir. But at Gregor's very first words, the chief clerk had already backed away, and only stared at him with parted lips over one twitching shoulder. And while Gregor was speaking, he did not stand still one moment, but stole away towards the door, without taking his eyes off Gregor. Yet only an inch at a time, as if obeying some secret injunction to leave the room, he were already at the hall, and the suddenness with which he took his last step out of the living room would have made one believe he would burn the soul of his friend. Oh, that's fair. This is my first time reading it. Lamp was quite insistent I do this one today, because he hasn't approved of some of my last and latest picks. It's interesting, though. I think I'll finish this paragraph and do my first little bit of analysis. So. Once in the hall, stretched his right arm towards the staircase, as if some supernatural power went in there to deliver him. Ah, fair enough. Well, I can't say I ever attended a university myself, being that I'm a rat, but it strikes me as pretty good. I don't understand why the chief clerk is so alarmed, though. I mean, I must admit, I don't know a lot of people, but a lot of the people whom I do know is giant bugs of various sorts, or owls or animal people. I guess it must be shocking the first time someone wakes up and it's a giant insect rather than a person, but I don't know. It seemed a little prejudicial of the chief clerk to be so horrified by his transformation. Then again, maybe I keep odd company. They do tell me people is prejudiced against VTubers, so maybe that's why they're so horrified that he's done like this. And yeah. Gregor perceived that the chief clerk must on no account be allowed to go away in the frame of mind of his position in the firm and not to be endangered at the utmost. His parents did not understand this so well. They had convinced themselves in the course of the years that Gregor was settled for life in the firm, and besides, they were so preoccupied with their immediate troubles, all foresight had forsaken them. Oh, that's no problem. I always appreciate someone, dropping by. I must admit, my streams are probably better for life progress. Ooh, a hard right. Thank you kindly, Tanner. Ooh, the water is spicy today. I don't know what that is. Yeah, Gregor had this foresight. The chief clerk must be detained, soothed, persuaded, and finally won over. The whole future of Gregor and his family depended on it. If only his sister had been there. She were intelligent. She had begun to cry while Gregor was still lying quietly on his back. And no doubt the chief clerk, so partial to ladies, would have been guided by her. She would have shut the door of the flat and in the hall and talked him out of his horror. She were not there, and Gregor would have to handle the situation himself. And without remembering that he was still unaware of what powers of movement he possessed, without even remembering that his words, in all possibility, indeed all likelihood, would again be unintelligible, he let go the wing of the door, pushed himself through the opening, and started to walk towards the chief clerk, who were already ridiculously clinging with both hands to the railing on the landing. But immediately, as he was feeling for a support, he fell down with a little cry upon all his numerous legs. Hardly were he down when he experienced, for the first time this morning, the sense of physical comfort. His legs had firm ground under them. They were completely obedient, as he noted with joy. They even strove to carry him forward in whatever direction he chose. And he were inclined to believe that a final relief from all his suffering were at hand. In the same moment, as he found himself on the floor, rocking with suppressed eagerness to move, not far from his mother, indeed just in front of her, she, which seemed so completely crushed, sprang all at once to her feet. Her arms and fingers outspread, cried, "Help! For God's sake, help!" Bent her head down as if to see Gregor better, but on the contrary kept back insensibly away. I'd quite forgotten that the laden table stood beyond her, sat upon it hastily as if in absence of mind, when she bumped into it, and seemed altogether unaware of the big coffee pot beside her was upset and pouring coffee in a flood over the carpet. "Mother, mother," said Gregor in his low voice, and looked up at her. The chief clerk, for the moment, had quite slipped from his mind. Instead, he could not resist snapping his jaws together at the sight of the creaming coffee. That made his mother scream again. She fled from the table and fell into the arms of his father, who hastened to catch her. But Gregor had no time to spare for his parents. The chief clerk were already on the stairs, with a chill on the banister. He would take one last backward look. Gregor made a spring, to be as sure as possible of overtaking him. The chief clerk must have divined his intention, for he let down several steps and vanished. He was still yelling, "Ah!" and it echoed through the older staircase. Unfortunately, the flight of the chief clerk seemed completely to upset Gregor's father, who had remained relatively calm until now. Instead of running after the man himself, or at least not hindering Gregor in his pursuit, he seized in his right hand the walking stick which the chief clerk had left behind at a chair, together with an hat and greatcoat, snatched in his left hand the large newspaper from the table, and began stamping his feet and flourishing the stick and the newspaper to drive Gregor back into his room. No entreaty of Gregor's availed. Indeed, no entreaty were even understood. However humbly he bent his head, his father only stamped on the floor the more loudly. Beyond his father, his mother had torn open a window, despite the cold weather, and were leaning far out of it with her face in her hands. A strong draught set in from the street to the staircase. The window curtains blew in, a newspaper on the table fluttered, stray pages whistled over the floor. Pitilessly, Gregor's father drove him back, hissing and crying, "Shoo!" like a savage. But Gregor was quite unpractised in walking backwards. It really were a slow business. If he had only a chance to turn round, he could get back into his room at once, but he was afraid of exasperating his father by showing that by the slowness of such a rotation, and at any moment the stick in his father's hand might hit him a fatal blow on the back or the head. In the end, however, nothing else was left for him to do, since in his horror, he observed that in moving backwards he couldn't even control the direction he took, and so keeping an anxious eye on his father all the time over his shoulder, he began to turn round as quickly as he could, which was in reality very slowly. Perhaps his father noted his good intentions, for he did not interfere except every now and then to help him in the manoeuvre from a distance with the point of the stick. If only he would have stopped making that unbearable hissing noise, made Gregor quite lose his head. It turned almost completely round when the hissing noise so distracted him that he even turned a little the wrong way again. When at last his head was fortunately right in front of the doorway, it appeared that his body was too broad to simply get through the opening. I've lost my place. His father, of course, in his present mood, were far from thinking of such a thing as opening the other half of the door to let Gregor have enough space. He had merely the fixed idea of driving Gregor back into his room as quickly as possible. He would never have suffered Gregor to make the circumstantial preparations for standing up on end and perhaps slipping his way through the door. Maybe we were now making more noise than ever to urge Gregor forward, as if no obstacle impeded him. To Gregor, anyhow, the noise in his rear no longer sounded like the voice of one simple father. This is really no joke, and Gregor thrust himself, come what might, into the doorway. One side of his body rose up, and he tilted at an angle in the doorway. His flank was quite bruised, horrid blotches stained the white door. Soon he was stuck fast, and, left to himself, could not have moved at all. His legs on one side, fluttering tremblingly in the air, those on the other were crushed painfully on the floor. And from behind, his father gave him a strong push, which was literally a deliverance, and he flew into the empty room, bleeding freely. The door was slammed behind him with a stick, and then at last there was silence. Oh, this story is in chapters. I didn't realise that. Okay. So that's the end of chapter 1. And we'll take a little break here for me to take a little sip, and then we'll do our habitual analysis. I never realised how rough you have it if you turn into a VTuber. I must admit, I'm not entirely familiar with the process of how you get sort of your human-animal hybrid people, being that I was just a normal rat before. I don't think when I was a rat outside the library I ever met any VTuber people, so the sort of people who are half animals are sort of new to me of recent. But it seems like it's pretty harsh. I mean, his family's treating him very badly, and it seems like he's really struggling to adapt to the new form. I mean, I guess I've only seen people who are sort of in control of it, you know, like Discipline and Ivy. They've got their things behind them. And I guess maybe being a moth isn't quite so horrible as I think he's some sort of roach. which I guess is more upsetting. But yeah, man, you must have it rougher. I feel I've misunderstood something about the VTubing community. I hope everyone else's family weren't quite so mean as they are to him. I mean, I know this is a story, so probably it's an extreme example, but I feel quite bad. I sometimes think it's rough being a rat, but well, I never had my own family treat me like that, so can't complain, I suppose. Right. So this story's taken longer than I expected it to, so I don't think I have much else to say. We'll press on. Still, it's interesting to find a story this relevant. I never expected to be reading a story about someone turning into a VTuber for the first time. It's a good pick, Balan. Right. Chapter 2. Not until it was twilight did Gregor awake out of a deep sleep, more like a swoon than a sleep. He was certainly awakened up of his own accord much later, for he felt himself sufficiently rested and well slept. It seemed to him as a fleeting step and cautious shifting of the door leading into the hall had aroused him. The electric lights in the street cast a pale sheen here and there on the ceiling and the upper surfaces of the furniture, but down below where he lay it was dark. Slowly, awkwardly trying out his feelers, which he now first learned to appreciate, he pushed his way to the door to see what had been happening there. His left side felt like one single, long, unpleasantly tense scar. He had actually the limp on his 2 rows of legs. One little leg, moreover, had been severely damaged in the course of that morning's events. It was almost a miracle that only one had been damaged, and trailed uselessly behind him. He reached the door before he discovered what had really drawn him to it, the smell of food. There stood a basin filled with fresh milk, in which floated a little sops of white bread. He could almost have laughed with joy, since he was now still hungrier than in the morning, and he dipped his head almost over the arse straight into the milk. But soon in disappointment he withdrew it again. Not only did he find it difficult to feed because of his tender left side, he could only feed with the palpitating collaboration of his whole body. He did not like the milk either, although milk had been his favourite drink, and that was certainly why his sister had set it there for him. Indeed, it was almost with repulsion that he turned away from the basin and crawled back to the middle of the room. He could see through the crack of the door that the gas was turned on in the living room, but while usually at this time his father made a habit of reading the afternoon newspaper in a loud voice to his mother, and occasionally to his sister as well, not a sound went out of the heard. Well, perhaps his father had recently given up this habit of reading aloud, which his sister had mentioned so often in conversation in her letters. There was the same silence all round, although the flat was certainly not empty of occupants. Not quite like a family's been looting, said Gregor to himself, and as he sat there motionless, staring into the darkness, he felt great pride in the fact that he had been able to provide such a life for his parents and sister in such a fine flat. But what if all the quiet, the comfort, the contentment were now to end in horror? To keep himself from being lost in such thoughts, Gregor took refuge in movement and crawled up and down the room. Once during the long evening, one of the side doors opened a little and quickly shut again. Later the other side door too. Someone had apparently wanted to come in and then thought better of it. Gregor now stationed himself immediately before the living room door, determined to persuade any hesitating visitor to come in, or at least to discover what they might be, who it might be. But the door was not opened again, and he waited in vain. In the early morning, when the doors were locked, they had all wanted to come in. Now that he had opened one door and the other had apparently been opened during the day, no one come in, and even the keys were on the other sides of the doors. It was late at night before the gas went out in the living room, and Gregor could easily tell that his parents and his sister had stayed awake until then. But you could clearly hear the 3 of them stealing away on tiptoe. No one likely to visit him, not until the morning, that was certain. So far he had plenty of time to meditate at his leisure on how he was to arrange his life afresh. The lofty empty room in which he had to lie flat on the floor filled him with an apprehension he could not account for, since it had been his very own room for the past 5 years. With half unconscious action, not without a slight feeling of shame, he scuttled under the sofa, where he felt comfortable at once, although his back were a little cramped and he could not lift his head up, and his only regret that his body was too broad to get the whole of it under the sofa. He stayed there all night, spending the time partly in a light slumber, from which his hunger kept waking him up with a start, and partly in worrying and sketching vague hopes, which all led to the same conclusion. He must lie low for the present, and, by exercising patience and the utmost consideration, help the family to bear the inconvenience he was bound to cause them in his present condition. Very early in the morning, it was still almost night. Gregor had the chance to test the strength of his new resolutions, for his sister, near fully dressed, opened the door from the hall and peered in. She did not see him at once, yet when she caught sight of him under the sofa, Well, he had to be somewhere. He couldn't have flown away, could he? She was so startled that without being able to help it, she slammed the door shut again. But as if regretting her behaviour, she opened the door again immediately, and coming on tiptoe, as if she were visiting an invalid or even a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head forward to the very edge of the sofa and watched her. Would she notice that he had left the milk standing, and not for lack of hunger? Would she bring in some other kind of food more to his taste? And if she did not do it of her own accord, he would rather starve than draw her attention to the fact, although he felt a wild impulse to dart out from under the sofa, throw himself at her feet and beg her for something to eat. But his sister at once noticed with surprise that the basin was still full, except for a little milk that had been spilt around it, and she lifted it immediately, not with her bare hands, true, but with a cloth, and carried it away. Gregor was wildly curious to know what she would bring instead, and made various speculations about it. But what she actually did next, in the goodness of her heart, he could never have guessed at. To find out what he liked, she brought him a whole selection of food, all set out on an old newspaper. There were old daft decayed vegetables, bones from last night's supper covered with a white sauce that had thickened, some raisins and almonds, a piece of cheese that Gregor would have called uneatable 2 days ago, a dry roll of bread, a buttered roll, and a roll both buttered and salted. Besides all that, she set down again the same basin into which she had poured some water, which were apparently to be reserved for his exclusive use. With a fine tact, knowing that Gregor would not eat in his presence, she withdrew quickly, and even turned the key to let him understand that he could take his ease as much as he liked. Gregor's legs all whizzed towards the food. His wounds must have healed completely, moreover, for he felt no disability, which amazed him and made him reflect how more than a month ago he had cut one finger a little with a knife, and had still suffered from pain in the wound only the day before yesterday. Am I less sensitive now, he thought, and sucked greedily at the cheese, which above all the other edibles attracted him at once and strongly. One after the other, and with tears of satisfaction in his eyes, he quickly devoured the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh food, on the other hand, it had no charms for him. He could not even stand the smell of it, and actually dragged it away to some little distance the things that he could eat. He had long finished his meal, and were only lazily lying on the same spot when his sister turned the key slowly, a sign for him to retreat. That roused him at once. They were nearly asleep, and he hurried under the sofa again. It took considerable self-control for him to stay under the sofa, even with the short time his sister were in the room, since the large meal had swollen his body somewhat, and he was so cramped that he could hardly breathe. Slight attacks of breathlessness affected him, and his eyes were starting a little out of his head as he watched his unsuspecting sister sweep together with a broom not only the remains of what he had eaten, but even the things he had not touched, as if those were now of no use to anyone, and actually shoveling it all into a bucket, which she covered with a wooden lid and carried away. Hardly had she turned her back when Gregor came out from under the sofa, had stretched and pulled himself out. That's interesting. I guess that would be a little weird to adapt to realising that you knew that your family member can now only eat mouldy food because they're a VTuber. Still, I suppose experimentation like is how people figured it out. In this manner, Gregor was fed once in the early morning while his parents were in the servant girl was still asleep, and a second time after they had all had their midday dinner, but then his parents took a short nap and the servant girl could be sent out on some errand or other by her sister. Not that they would have wanted him to start, of course, but perhaps they could not have borne to know more about his feeding than from her say. Perhaps, too, his sister wanted to spare them such little anxieties wherever possible, since they had quite enough to bear as it was. Under what pretext the doctor and the locksmith had been got rid of in this first morning, Gregor could not discover, but since what he said were not understood by the others, it never struck any of them, not even his sister, that he could understand what they said, and so whenever his sister came into his room he had to content himself with hearing her utter only a sigh now and then, an occasional appeal to the saints. Later on, when she had got a little used to the situation, of course she could never get completely used to it, she sometimes threw out a remark which kindly meant, or could be so interpreted. Well, he liked his dinner today, she would say when Gregor had made a good clearance of his food, and when he had not eaten, which gradually happened more and more often, she would say almost sadly, everything's been left standing again. But though Gregor could get no news directly, he overheard a lot from the neighbouring rooms, and as soon as voices were audible, he would run to the door of the rooms, cornered, and press his whole body against it. In the first few days especially, there were no conversations that did not refer to him somehow, even if only indirectly. For 2 whole days there were family consultants at every mealtime about what should be done, but also between meals the same subject was discussed. There were always at least 2 members of the family at home, since no one wanted to be alone in the flat, and to leave it quite empty were unthinkable. And on the very first of these days, the household cook, not quite clear what and how much she knew of the situation, went down on her knees to his mother and begged to leave to go. When she departed a quarter of an hour later, gave thanks for her dismissal with tears in her eyes, as if for the greatest benefit that could have been conferred on her. Without any prompting, swore a solemn oath that she would never say a single word to anyone about what had happened. Now Gregor's sister had to cook too, helping his mother, true. The cooking did not amount to much. They ate scarcely anything. Gregor always hearing one of the family vainly urging another to eat and getting no answer but "Thanks, I've had all I want," or something similar. Perhaps they drunk nothing either. Time and again his sister kept asking his father if he wouldn't like some beer, and offered kindly to go and fetch it herself. And when he made no answer, suggested that she could ask the concierge to fetch it, so he need feel no sense of obligation. But then around "No" came from his father, and no more was said about it. In the course of the very first day, Gregor's father explained the family's financial position and prospects to both his mother and sister. Now and then he rose from the table to get some voucher or memorandum out of the small safe, as he had rescued from the collapse of his business 5 years earlier. One could hear him opening the complicated lock and rustling papers out and shutting it again. This statement made by his father were the first cheerful information Gregor had heard since his imprisonment. He had been of the opinion that nothing at all were left over from his father's business. At least his father had never said anything to the contrary, and of course he had not asked him directly. At the time, Gregor's sole desire would do his utmost to help the family to forget as soon as possible the catastrophe which had overwhelmed the business and thrown them all into a state of complete despair. And so he had set to work with unusual ardour. Almost overnight had become a commercial traveller instead of a little clerk, with of course much greater chance of earning money. The success were immediately translated in a good round coin which he could lay on the table for his amazed and happy family. These had been fine times, and they had never recurred, at least not with the same sense of glory, though later on Gregor had earned so much money that he was able to meet the expense of the whole household and did so. They had simply got used to it, both the family and Gregor. The money was gratefully accepted and gladly given, but there were no special uprush of warm feeling. With his sister alone he had remained intimate, and it were a secret plan of his that she, who loved music, unlike himself, and could play movingly on the violin, should be sent next year to study at the conservatorium, despite the great expense that would entail, which must be made up in some other way. During his brief visits home, the conservatorium were often mentioned in the talks he had with his sister, but always merely as a beautiful dream which could never come true. His parents discouraged even these innocent references to it. Yet Gregor had made up his mind firmly about it, and meant to announce the fact with due solemnity on Christmas Day. Such were the thoughts, completely futile in his present condition, that went through his head as he stood clinging uprightly to the door and listening. Sometimes, out of sheer weariness, he had to give up listening, and let his head fall negligently against the door. He always had to pull himself together again at once, for even the slight sound of his head made was audible next door, for all conversation was stopped. "What can he be doing now?" his father would say after a while, obviously turning towards the door. Only then would the interrupted conversation gradually begin to get going again. Gregor was now informed as amply as he could wish, for his father tended to repeat himself in his explanations, partly because it was a long time since he had handled such matters, and partly because his mother could not always grasp things at once. A certain amount of investments, a very small amount of it, were true, had survived the wreck of their fortunes, and even increased a little because the dividends had not been touched meanwhile. And beside that, the money Gregor had brought home every month, he kept only a few dollars for himself, had never been quite used up, and now amounted to a small capital sum. Behind the door, Gregor nodded his head eagerly, rejoiced at this evidence of unexpected thrift and foresight. True, he could really have paid off some more of his father's debts to the chief with this extra money, and so brought so much nearer the day on which he could quit his job, but doubtless it were better the way his father had arranged. Yet this capital were by no means sufficient to let the family live on the interest of it. For 1 year perhaps, or at most 2, they could live on the principal, and that were all. It was simply a sum that ought not to be touched and should be kept for a rainy day. Money for living expenses would have to be earned. Well, his father was still hale enough, but an old man, and he had done no work for the past 5 years, and could not be expected to do much. During these 5 years, the first years of leisure in his labour throughout a laborious though unsuccessful life, he had grown rather fat and become sluggish. And Gregor's old mother, how was she to earn a living with her asthma, which troubled her even when she walked through the flat, and kept her lying on a sofa every other day, panting for breath beside an open window? And was his sister to earn her bread, she who was still a child, at 17, and whose life had hitherto been so pleasant, consisting as it did as dressing herself nicely, sleeping long, helping in the housekeeping, going out to a few modest entertainments, and above all playing the violin. At first, whenever the leave for earning money were mentioned, Gregor let go his hold on the store and threw himself down on the cool leather sofa beside it. He felt so hot with shame and grief. Often he just lay there the long nights, though without sleeping at all, scrabbling for hours on the leather, or he nerved himself to the great effort of pushing an armchair to the window, and crawled up over the windowsill, and, braced against the chair, leaned against the window panes, obviously in some recollection of the sense of freedom that looking out a window always used to give him. For in reality, day by day, things that were even a little way off were growing dimmer to his sight. The hospital across the street, which he used to excrete for being all too often before his eyes, were now quite beyond his range of vision. And if he had not known that he lived in Charlotte Street, a quiet street, but still a city street, he might have believed that his window gave out on a desert waste, where grey sky and grey land blended indistinguishably into each other. His quick-witted sister only needed to observe twice that the armchair stood by the window. After that, whenever she had tidied the room, she always pushed the chair back to the same place at the window, and even left the inner casement open. If he could have spoken to her, and thanked her for all she had to do for him, he could have borne her ministrations better. As it were, they oppressed him. She certainly tried to make as light as possible of whatever was disagreeable in her task. And as time went on, she succeeded, of course, more and more. But time brought more enlightenment to Gregor, too. The very way she came in distressed him. Hardly was she in the room when she rushed to the window, without even taking time to shut the door, carefully as she always was to shield the sight of Gregor's room from the others. And as if she were almost suffocating, tore the casements open with hasty fingers, staring at them in the open draught for a while, even in the bitterest cold, and drawing deep breaths. The noisy scurry of hers upset Gregor twice a day. He would crouch trembling under the sofa, all the time, knowing quite well that she would certainly have spared him such disturbance as he found it at all possible to stay in his presence without opening the windows. That's the famous VTuber smell, I suppose. On one occasion, about a month after Gregor's metamorphosis, and there was surely no reason at all for her to be still startled at his appearance, she came a little earlier than usual, and found him gazing out the window, quite motionless, and thus well placed to look like a bogey. Greg would not have been surprised had she not come in at her door, but she could not immediately open the window while he were there. But not only did she retreat, she jumped back as if in alarm, and banged the door shut. Hang on a second, just got to kill that guy. A stranger might well have thought that he had been lying and waiting for her there, meaning to bite her. Of course, he hid himself under the sofa at once. He had to wait until midday before she come again, and she seemed still more ill at ease than usual. This made him realise how repulsive the sight of him was to her, and they were bound to go on being repulsive, and what an effort it must cost her not to run away even from the sight of the small portion of his body that stuck out from under the sofa. In order to spare her that, therefore, one day he carried a sheet on his back to the sofa. It cost him 4 hours' labour, and arranged it there in such a way as to hide him completely, so that even if she would have bent down she could not see him. As she considered the sheet unnecessary, she would certainly have stripped it off the sofa again, for it was clear enough that this curtaining and confinement of himself were not likely to conduce to Gregor's comfort, but she left it where it were, and Gregor even fancied that he caught a thankful glance from her eye when he lifted the sheet carefully, a very little with his head, to see how she would take in the new arrangement. For the first night, his parents could not bring themselves to the point of entering his room, and he often heard them expressing their appreciation of his sister's activities, whereas formerly they had frequently scolded her for being, as they thought, a somewhat useless daughter. And now both of them often waited outside the door, his father and mother, while his sister tidied his room, and as soon as she came out, she had to tell him exactly how things were in the room, what Gregor had eaten, how he conducted himself this time, whether there were not perhaps some slight improvement in his condition. His mother, moreover, began relatively soon to want to visit him, but his father and sister dissuaded her at first, with arguments which Gregor listened to very attentively, and altogether approved of. Later, however, she had to be held back by main force when she cried out, "Do let me go in to Gregor. He's my unfortunate son. Can you understand that I must go to him?" Gregor thought that it might be well to have her come in, not every day, of course, but perhaps once a week. She understood things, after all, much better than his sister, who were only a child despite the efforts she was making, and perhaps taken on so difficult a task merely out of childless thoughtlessness. Gregor's desire to see his mother was soon fulfilled. During the daytime he did not want to show himself at the window, only out of consideration for his parents. He could not crawl very far around the few square yards of floor space he had, nor could he bear lying quietly at rest all during the night while he were fast losing the interest he had ever taken in food, so that for mere recreation he had formed the habit of crawling criss-cross over the walls and ceiling. He especially enjoyed hanging suspended from the ceiling. It was much better than lying on the floor. One could breathe more freely, one's body swung and rocked lightly, and the almost blissful absorption induced by the suspension, it could happen, to his own surprise, that he let go and fell plump to the floor. He now had his body much better under control than formerly, and even such a big fall did him no harm. His sister at once remarked that a new distraction Gregor had found himself. He left traces behind him of the sticky stuff and the soles wherever he crawled, and she got the idea in her head of giving him as wide a field as possible to crawl in, and of removing the piece of furniture that hindered him, above all the chest of drawers and the writing desk. That were more than she could manage by herself. She did not dare ask her father to help her. And as for the servant girl, a young creature of 16 who had the courage to stay on after the cook's departure, she could not be asked to help. She had begged as an especial favour that she might keep the kitchen door locked and open it only on a definite summons. So there was nothing left but to apply to her mother for an hour when her father were out. And the old lady did come, in exclamations of joyful eagerness, which, however, died away at the door of Gregor's room. Gregor's sister, of course, went in first to see that everything were in order before letting his mother enter. In great haste, Gregor pulled the sheet lower and rocked it more in folds, so that it really looked as if it had been thrown accidentally over the sofa. And this time he did not peer out from under it. He renounced the pleasure of seeing his mother on this occasion, and were only glad that she had come at all. "Come in, he's out of sight," his sister, obviously leading the mother by the hand. Gregor could now hear the two women struggling to shift the heavy old chest from its place, and his sister claiming the greater part of the labour for herself, without listening to the admonitions of her mother, who feared she might overstrain herself. It took a long time, at least a quarter of an hour's tugging. His mother objected that the chest had better be left where it were, for in the first place it was too heavy and could never be got out before her father came home, and standing in the middle of the room like that it would only hamper Gregor's movements, while in the second place it were not at all certain that removing the furniture would be doing a service to Gregor. She inclined to think the contrary. The sight of the naked wall made her own heart heavy, and why shouldn't Gregor have the same feeling, considering that he had been used to his furniture for so long? Might well feel forlorn without it. "And doesn't it look?" she concluded in a low voice. In fact, she had almost been whispering till that time, to avoid letting Gregor, whose exact whereabouts she did not know, hear even the tones of her voice, for she convinced that he could not understand the words. "Doesn't it look as if we were showing him, by taking away his furniture, that we've given up hope of his ever getting better, and just leaving him coldly to himself? I think it would be best to keep his room exactly as it has always been, so that when he comes back to us he will find everything unchanged, and be able all the more easily to forget what has happened in between." On hearing these words from his mother, Gregor realised that the lack of all direct human speech for the past 2 months together, with the monotony of family life, must have confused his mind. Otherwise he could not account for the fact that he had quite earnestly looked forward to having his room empty to furnish him. Oh, Buster check it is. Oh. Fair play, yeah. I'm a bit hunched over there. Be straight in the back. Thank you for that, dinner. On hearing these words from his mother, Gregor realised that the lack of all direct human speech for the past 2 months together with the monotony of family life must have confused his mind. Otherwise he could not account for the fact that he had quite earnestly looked forward to having his room empty to furnish him. Did he really want his warm room, so comfortably fitted with old familiar furniture, to be turned into a naked den, in which he would certainly be able to crawl unhampered in all directions, at the price of shedding simultaneously all recollection of his human background? He had indeed been so near the brink of forgetfulness that only the voice of his mother, which he had not heard for so long, had drawn him back from it. Nothing should be taken out of his room. Everything must stay as it was. He couldn't dispense with a good influence of the furniture in his state of mind, and even if the furniture did hamper him in the senseless crawling round and round, well, that was no drawback but a great advantage. Unfortunately, his sister had a contrary opinion. She had grown accustomed, not without reason, to consider herself an expert in Gregor's affairs and agents, and as against her parents, and so her mother's advice were now enough to make her determined on the removal not only of the chest and the writing desk, which had been her first intentions, but of all the furniture except the indispensable sofa. This determination was not, of course, merely the outcome of childish recalcitrance to the self-confidence she had recently developed so unexpectedly and at such cost. She had in fact perceived that Gregor needed a lot of space to crawl about in. On the other hand, he never used the furniture at all, so as far as could be seen. Another factor might also have been the enthusiastic temperament of an adolescent girl, and seeks to indulge herself on every opportunity, and which now tempted Greta to exaggerate the horror of her brother's circumstances, in order that she might do all the more for him. In a room where Gregor lorded all alone over empty walls, and no one save himself will likely overset foot. And so she would not be moved from her resolve by her mother, who seemed moreover to be ill at ease in Gregor's room, and therefore unsure of herself, was soon reduced to silence and helped her daughter as best she could to push the chest outside. Now, Gregor could do without the chest, if need be, but the writing desk he must retain. As soon as the two women had got the chest out of his room, groaning as they pushed it, Gregor stuck his head out from under the sofa to see how he might intervene as kindly and cautiously as possible. But as bad luck would have it, his mother was the first to return, leaving Greta clasping the chest in the room next door, where she was trying to shift it all by herself, without of course moving it from the spot. His mother, however, was not accustomed to the sight of him. It must sicken her, and so in alarm, Gregor backed quickly in the other end of the sofa, yet could not prevent the sheet from swaying a little in front. That were enough to put her on the alert. She paused, stood still for a moment, and went back to Greta. Though Gregor kept reassuring himself that nothing out of the way was happening, that only a few bits of furniture were being changed around, he soon had to admit that all this trotting to and fro of the two women, their little ejaculations and scrapings of furniture along the floor, affected him like a vast disturbance, coming from all sides at once. And however much he tucked his head and legs and cowered to the very floor, he was bound to confess that he would not be able to stand it for long. They were clearing his room out, taking away everything he loved. The chest in which he kept his fret saw and other tools were already dragged off. They were now loosening the writing desk, which almost sunk into the floor. The desk at which he had done all his own work when he were at the commercial academy at the grammar school. He had no more time to waste away on the good intentions of the two women, whose existence he had by now almost forgotten, for they were so exhausted they were labouring in silence, and nothing could be heard but the heavy scuffling of their feet. And so he rushed out. The women were just leaning against the writing desk in the next room to give themselves a breather, and 4 times changed his direction, since he really did not know what to rescue first. Then on the wall opposite, which were already otherwise cleared, he was struck by the picture of the lady, muffled in so much fur, and quickly crawled up to it and pressed himself to the glass, which were a good surface to hold on to, and comforted his hot belly. This picture, at least, which were entirely hidden beneath him, was going to be removed by nobody. He turned his head towards the door of the living room as to observe the women when they come back. They had not allowed themselves much of a rest, and were already coming. Greta had twined her arms around her mother and were almost supporting her. "Well, what shall we take now?" said Greta, looking around. Her eyes met Gregor's from the wall. She kept her composure, presumably because of her mother, bent her head down to her mother to keep her from looking up, and said, although in a fluttering, impedimented voice, "Come, hadn't we better go back to the living room for a moment?" Her intentions were clear enough to Gregor. She wanted to bestow her mother in safety and then chase him down from the wall. Well, just let her try it. He clung to his picture and would not give it up. He would rather fly on Greta's face. But Greta's words had succeeded in disquieting her mother. He took a step to one side, caught sight of the huge brown mass on the flowered wallpaper, and, before she was really conscious that what she saw was Gregor, screamed in a loud, hoarse voice, "Oh God! Oh God!" fell with outspread arms over the sofa, as if giving up the ghost, and did not move. "Gregor!" cried his sister, shaking her fist and glaring at him. This was the first time she had directly aggressed him since his metamorphosis. She ran into the next room for some aromatic essence with which to rouse her mother from her fainting fit. Gregor wanted to help too. There was still time to rescue the picture, but he was stuck fast to the glass and had to tear himself loose. He then ran after his sister into the next room as if he could advise her, as he used to do, but then had to stand helpless behind her. She, meanwhile, searched among various small bottles, and when she turned around, started an alarm at the sight of him. One bottle fell to the floor and broke. A splinter of glass cut Gregor's face, and some kind of corrosive medicine flashed him. Without pausing a moment longer, Greta gathered up all the bottles she could carry and ran to her mother with them. She banged the door shut with her foot. Gregor was now cut off from his mother, who was perhaps nearly dying because of him. He dared not open the door for fear of frightening away his sister, who had to stay with his mother. There was nothing he could do but wait, and harassed by self-reproach and worry, he began to crawl to and fro over everything, walls, furniture and ceiling, and finally, in his despair, when the whole room seemed to be reeling around him, fell down in the middle of the big table. A little while elapsed. Gregor was still lying there feebly, and all around were quiet. Perhaps that were a good omen. Then the doorbell rang. The servant girl were of course locked in her kitchen, and Greta would have to open the door. It was his father. "What's been happening?" were his first words. Greta's face must have told him everything. Greta answered in a muffled voice, apparently hiding her head on his breast. "Mother has been fainting, but she's better now. Gregor's broken loose." "Just what I expected," his father said. "Just what I've been telling you, but you woman will never listen." It was clear to Gregor that his father had taken the worst interpretation of Greta's all too brief statement, and was assuming that Gregor had been guilty of some violent act. Therefore Gregor must now try to propitiate his father, since he had neither time nor means for an explanation, and so he fled to the door of his own room and crouched against it, to let his father see as soon as he came in from the hall that his son had the good intention of getting back into his room immediately, and it would not necessarily drive him there, but that if only the door opened he would disappear at once. His father were not in the mood to perceive such fine distinctions. "Ah!" he cried as soon as he appeared, in a tone which sounded at once angry and exultant. Gregor drew his head back from the door and lifted it to look at his father. Truly, this was not the father he had imagined to himself. Admittedly, he had been too absorbed of late in his new recreation, crawling over the ceiling, to take the same interest as before in what were happening elsewhere in the flat. He ought really be prepared for some changes. And yet, could that be his father? The man who used to lie wearily sunk in his bed whenever Gregor set out on a business journey, who welcomed him back of an evening lying in long chairs in a dressing ground, who could not really rise to his feet, but only lifted his arms in greeting, and on the rare occasion when he did go out with the family, on 1 or 2 Sundays a year or on high holidays, walked between Gregor and his mother, who would slowly walk as anyhow, even more slowly than they did, muffled in his old greatcoat, shuffling laboriously forward with the help of his crook-handled cane, which he set down more cautiously at every step, and whenever he wanted to say anything, nearly always come to a full stop, and gathered his escort around him. Now he was standing there in fine shape, dressed in a smart blue uniform with gold buttons, such as bank managers wear. His strong double chin bulged over the stiff eye collar of his jacket. From under his bushy eyebrows, his black eyes darted fresh and penetrating glances. His one-time tangled white hair had been combed flat on either side of the shining and carefully exact parting. His pitch cap, which bore a gold monogram, probably the badge of some bank, in a wide sweep across the old room on a sofa, with the tail ends of his jacket thrown back, his hands in his trouser pockets, advanced with a grim visage towards Gregor. Likely enough, he did not himself know what he meant to do. At any rate, he lifted his feet uncommonly high, and Gregor was dumbfounded at the enormous size of his shoe soles. But Gregor could not risk standing up to him, aware as he had been from the very first day of his new life. His father believed only the severest measures suitable for dealing with him, and so he ran before his father, stopping when he stopped, and shuttling forward again when his father made any kind of move. In this way they circled the room several times without anything decisive happening. Indeed, the whole operation did not even look like a pursuit, because it was carried out so slowly. And so Gregor did not leave the floor, for he feared that his father might take as a piece of particular wickedness any exertion of his over the walls or ceiling. All the same, he could not stay this course much longer. While his father took one step, he had to carry out a whole series of movements. He was already beginning to feel breathless, just as in his former life his lungs had not been very dependable. As he was staggering along, trying to concentrate his energy on running, hardly keeping his eyes open, in his dazed state he never even thinking of any other escape than simply going forward. And having almost forgotten that the walls were free to him, which in this room were well provided with finely carved pieces of furniture full of knobs and crevices, suddenly something lightly flung landed close behind him and rolled before him. It was an apple. A second apple followed immediately. Gregor came to a stop in alarm. There was no point in running on, for his father was determined to bombard him. He had filled his pockets with fruit from the dish on the sideboard and was now shying apple after apple, without taking particularly good aim for the moment. The small red apples rolled about the floor as if magnetised and cannon into each other. An apple thrown without much force grazed Gregor's back and glanced off harmlessly, but another following immediately landed right on his back and sank in. Gregor wanted to drag himself forward, as if this startling and incredible pain could be left behind him, but he felt as if nailed to the spot and flattened himself out in a complete derangement of all his senses. With his last conscious look, he saw the door of his room being torn open and his mother rushing out ahead of his screaming sister, in her underbodice, for her daughter had loosened her clothing to let her breathe more freely and recover from her swoon. He saw his mother rushing towards his father, leaving one after another behind her on the floor, her loosened petticoats, stumbling over her petticoats straight into his father and embracing him in complete union with him. But here Gregor's sight began to fail, with her hands clasped around his father's neck as she begged for her son's life. That's the end of chapter 2. I'll take a little drink of water and then we'll do some discussion. Right. So it seems Gregor is having quite a lot of difficulties adjusting to the new life as a VTuber. It seems that his form is quite an unpleasant one, this sort of roach thing. And while he's got some cool little abilities, like the ability to crawl on the walls and such, his family doesn't seem to like it much. And of course the standard VTuber adjustments like eating mouldy food and having a particular odour about him are rough. It also seems like they can't understand him, so I guess he's probably one of them VTubers who needs sort of a text-to-speech device to aid him. And I think this was written in sort of the 40s and 50s, so probably such a thing didn't exist at the time, so he just can't be understood, which is rough, I suppose. It must be hard to be a VTuber in that sort of a situation. And obviously, I mean, this is before the time of streaming, so he doesn't even have any way to do work, and he feels pretty wretched about it. and he's becoming detached from his old life. But you can see, the sort of way that he is built for streaming. He really freaks out at the idea of the desk being taken away, even if there's no computer to have it. I don't know. I don't understand the phenomenon of VTubers. How just humans become these sort of semi-animal people. And it seems like, at least at the time this was written, it wasn't very well understood amongst the people who were experiencing it either. At least it's the way his family is acting is considered to be typical of the time. But yeah, I feel bad for poor Gregor Samsa. Feel bad for him indeed. Still. And of course his father seemingly has gone right back to work, meaning that he could have, well, it means that it sort of undercuts all of his hard work before as well, and the job he hated. And there's the money that was squirreled away, that obviously he's thankful his family has it, but it could have eased his burdens and released him from his job earlier. So it seems that he was quite ill-used by his family even before he turned into a VTuber, so I don't know. There's quite a lot going on here, but I'm going to press on, because I do worry that it's getting quite warm in here, and it was around this time last stream that we had some technical difficulties, so I'm hoping that there's no sign of them so far that I've noticed, but we'll press on and just try and hope that we can get through the rest of this before anything happens. I think this will be the last chapter, so hopefully it all works out. Chapter 3. The serious injury done to Gregor, which disabled him for more than a month, the apple went on sticking into his body as a visible reminder, as no one ventured to remove it, seeming to have made even his father recollect that Gregor was a member of the family, despite his present unfortunate and repulsive shape. And I'm not to be treated as an enemy that, on the contrary, family duty required the suppression of disgust and the exercise of patience. Nothing but patience. And although his injury had impaired, probably forever, his powers of movement, and for the time being it took him long minutes to creep across his room like an old invalid, there was no question now crawling up the wall. In his own opinion, he was sufficiently compensated for this worsening of his condition by the fact that towards the evening the living room door, which he used to watch intently for an hour or two beforehand, were always thrown open, so that lying in the darkness of his room, invisible to his family, he could see them all at the lamplit table, and listen to their talk, by general consent as it were, very different from his earlier eavesdropping. True, their intercourse lacked the lively character of former times, which he had always called to mind with a certain wistfulness in the small hotel bedrooms where he had been wont to throw himself down, tired out on damp bedding. They were now mostly very silent. Soon after supper his father would fall asleep in his armchair. His mother and sister would admonish one another to be silent. His mother, bending low over the lamp, stitched a fine seam for an underwear firm. His sister had taken a job as a salesgirl while learning shorthand and French in the evenings on the chance of bettering herself. Sometimes his father woke up and, as if quite unaware that he had been sleeping, said to his mother, "What a lot of sewing you're doing today," and once fell asleep again, when the two women exchanged a tired smile. With a kind of mulishness his father persisted in keeping his uniform on, even in the house. His dressing gown hung uselessly on its peg, and he slept fully dressed where he sat, as if he were ready for service at any moment, and even here only at the beck and call of his superior. As a result, his uniform, which were not brand new to start with, began to look dirty, despite all the love and care of the mother and sister to keep it clean. And Gregor often spent the whole evenings gazing at the many greasy spots on the garment, gleaming with gold buttons, always in a state of polish, in which the old man sat sleeping in extreme discomfort, and yet quite peacefully. As soon as the clock struck 10, his mother tried to rouse father with gentle words, and would persuade him, after that, to get into bed, for sitting there he could not have a proper sleep, and that was what he needed most, since he had to go on duty at 6. With the mulishness that had obsessed him since he had become a bank messenger, he always insisted on staying longer at the table, though he regularly fell asleep again, and in the end only with the greatest trouble could be got out of his armchair and into his bed. However insistently Gregor's mother and sister kept urging him with gentle reminders, he would go on slowly, shaking his head for a quarter of an hour, keeping his eyes shut, and refused to get to his feet. And mother picked at his sleeve, whispering endearments in his ear, and sister left her lessons to come to her mother's help. But Gregor's father would not be caught. He would only sink down deeper into his chair. Not until the two women hoisted him up by the armpits did he open his eyes and look at them both, one after the other, usually with the remark, This is a life. This is the peace and quiet of my old age." And leaning on the two of them, he would heave himself up with difficulty, as if he were a great burden to himself, suffer them to lead him as far as the outer door, and then wave them off to go on alone. While the mother abandoned her needlework and the sister her pen and would have run after him and help him further. Who could find time in this overworked and tired out family to bother about Gregor more than was absolutely needful? This household were reduced more and more. The servant girl were turned off. A gigantic bony charwoman white flying air round their head, coming morning and evening to do the rough work. Everything else were grown by Gregor's mother, as well as great piles of sewing. Even various family ornaments, which his mother and sister used to wear with pride at parties and celebrations, had to be sold, as Gregor discovered of an evening from hearing them all discuss the prices obtained. What they lamented was for the fact they could not leave the flat, which now was much too big for their present circumstances, because they could not think of any way to shift Gregor. Yet Gregor saw well enough that consideration for him were not the main difficulty preventing the removal, but they could have easily shifted him in some suitable box with a few air holes in it. What really kept them from moving to another flat were rather their own complete hopelessness, and belief that they had been singled out for a misfortune such as never happened to any of their relationships or acquaintances. They fulfilled, to the uttermost, all the world demands of poor people. The father fetched breakfast for the small clerks in the bank. The mother devoted her energy to make an end of life for strangers. The sister trotted to and fro behind the counter at the behest of customers. But more than that, they had not the strength to do. And the wound in Gregor's back began to nag him afresh when his mother and sister, after getting his father into bed, come back again, left their work lying, and drew close to each other and sat cheek by cheek. When his mother, pointing towards his room, said, "Shut the door now, Greta," and they were left again in darkness, while next door the women mingled their tears, or perhaps sat dry-eyed staring at the table. Gregor hardly slept at all by night or by day. He often haunted by the idea that the next time the door opened he would take the family's affairs in hand again, just as he used to do. Once more, after this long interval, there appeared in his thoughts the figure of the chief, and the chief clerk, the commercial travellers and the apprentices, the porter who was so dull-witted, 2 or 3 friends in other firms, a chambermaid in one of the rural hotels, a sweet and fleeting memory, a cashier in a milliner's shop, whom he had wooed earnestly, but too slowly. They all appeared together, as strangers, or people he had quite forgotten, but instead of helping him and his family, they were all unapproachable, and he was glad when they vanished. At other times he would not be in the mood to bother about his family, and he were only filled with rage at the way they were neglecting him. And although he had no clear idea of what he might care to eat, he would make plans for getting into the larder to take the food that were after all his due, even if he were not hungry. His sister no longer took thought to bring him what might be especially to please him, but in the morning and noon, before she went to business, already pushed into his room with her foot any food that were available. In the evening cleared it out again with one sweep of the broom, heedless whether it had been merely tasted or, as most frequently happened, left untouched. The cleaning of his room, which he now did always in the evenings, could not have been more hastily done. Streaks of dirt stretched along the walls here and there, lay balls of dust and filth. At first Gregor used to station himself in some particularly filthy corner when his sister arrived, in order to reproach her with it, so to speak. But he could have sat there for weeks without getting her to make any improvement. She could see the dust as well as he did, but she had simply made up her mind to leave it alone. And yet, with a touchiness that were now new to her, which seemed anyhow to have infected the old family, she jealously guarded her claim to be the sole caretaker of Gregor's room. His mother once subjected his room to a thorough cleaning, which achieved only by means of several buckets of water. All this dampness, of course, upset Gregor too, and he lay widespread, sulky and motionless on the sofa. But she was well punished for it. Hardly had his sister noticed the changed aspect of his room that evening, and she rushed in high dudgeon into the living room, and, despite the imploringly raised hands of her mother, burst into a storm of weeping. While her parents, her father had of course been startled out of his chair, looked on first in helpless amazement. They too began to go into action. The father approached the mother on his right for not having left to clean the Gregor's room to his sister, shrieked at the sister on his left that never again was she to be allowed to clean Gregor's room, while the mother tried to pull the father into his bedroom since he was beyond himself with agitation. The sister, shaken with sobs, then beat upon the table with her small fists. And Gregor hissed loudly with rage because not one of them thought of shutting the door to spare him such a spectacle and so much noise. Still, even if the sisters, exhausted by her daily work, had grown tired of looking after Gregor as she did formerly, there was no need for his mother's intervention or for Gregor's being neglected at all. The charwomen were there. The old widow, whose strong, bony frame had enabled her to survive the worst of long life could offer, by no means recoiled from Gregor. Without being in the least curious, she had once by chance opened the door of his room and at the sight of Gregor, who, taken by surprise, began to rush to and fro, although no one were chasing him, merely stood there with her arms folded. From that time she never failed to open the door a little for a moment, morning and evening, to have a look at him. First she even used to call him to her with words which apparently she took to be friendly, such as, "Come along then, you old dung beetle," or "Look at the old dung beetle then." Such elocution Gregor made no answer, but stayed motionless where he was, as if the door had never been opened. Instead of being allowed to disturb him so senselessly whenever the whim took her, she should have rather been ordered to clean out his room daily, that charwoman. Once, early in the morning, heavy rain was lashing on the window panes, perhaps a sign that spring were on the way. Gregor was so exasperated when she began addressing him again that he ran at her, as if to attack her, though slowly and feebly enough. But the charwoman, instead of showing fright, merely lifted high a chair that happened to be beside the door, and as she stood there with her mouth wide open, it was clear that she meant to shut it only when she brought the chair down on Gregor's back. "So you're not coming any nearer?" she asked as Gregor turned away again and quietly put the chair back in the corner. Gregor now eaten hardly anything. Only when he happened to pass the food laid out for him did he take a bite of something in his mouth as pastime. Kept it there for an hour at a time and usually spat it out again. At first he thought it would chagrin over the state of his room that prevented him from eating. He soon got used to the various changes in his room. It had become an habit in the family to push into his room things that there were no room for elsewhere, and there were plenty of these now, since one of the rooms had been let to 3 lodgers. These serious young men, all 3 of them with full beards, as Gregor had once observed through a crack in the door, and a passion for order, not only in their own room, but, since they were now members of the household, in all its arrangements, especially in the kitchen. Superfluous, not to say dirty objects, they could not bear. Besides, they had brought with them the most of the furnishing they need. For this reason, many things could be dispensed with that were no use trying to sell, but that should not be thrown away either. All of them found their way into Gregor's room. The ash can likewise, and the kitchen garbage can. Anything that were not needed for the moment was simply flung into Gregor's room by the charwoman, who did everything in a hurry. Fortunately, Gregor usually saw only the object, whatever it was, and the hand that held it. Perhaps she intended to take the things away again as time and opportunity offered, or to collect them until she could throw them all out in a heap. But in fact, they just lay wherever she happened to throw them, except when Gregor pushed his way through the junk heap and shifted it somewhat. At first out of necessity, because he had not room enough to crawl, but later with increasing enjoyment, although after such excursions, being sad and weary to death, he would lie motionless for hours. And since the lodgers often ate their supper at home in the common living room, the living room door stayed shut many an evening. Yet Gregor reconciled himself quite easily to the shutting of the door, for enough on an evening, when it was opened, he had to disregard it entirely, and remain in the darkest corner of his room, quite unnoticed by the family. But on one occasion, the charwoman left the door open a little, and it stayed ajar even when the lodgers came in for supper, and the lamp was lit. They set themselves at the top end of the table, where formerly Gregor and his father and mother had eaten their meals, unfolded their napkins, and took knife and fork in hand. At once his mother appeared in the other doorway with a dish of meat, and close behind his sister with a dish of potatoes piled high. The food steamed with a thick vapour. The lodgers bent over the food, set before them as if to scrutinise it before eating. In fact, the man in the middle, who seemed to pass from an authority with the other 2, cut a piece of meat as it lay on the dish, obviously to discover if it were tender or should be sent back to the kitchen. He showed satisfaction, and Gregor's mother and sister, who had been watching anxiously, breathed freely and began to smile. The family itself took its meals in the kitchen. Nonetheless, Gregor's father came into the living room before going into the kitchen. With one prolonged bow, cap in hand, made a round of the table. The lodgers all stood up and murmured something in their beards. When they were alone again, they ate their food in almost complete silence. It seemed remarkable to Gregor that among the various noises coming from the table, he could always distinguish the sound of their masticating teeth, as if they were a sign of Gregor that one needed teeth in order to eat, and with toothless jaws, even of the finest make, one could do nothing. "I'm hungry enough," said Gregor, sadly to himself, "but not for that kind of food. How these lodgers are stuffing themselves, and here I am dying of starvation." On that very evening, during the whole of his time there, Gregor could not remember ever having heard the violin. The sound of violin playing came from the kitchen. The lodgers had already finished their supper. The one in the middle had brought out a newspaper and given the other 2 a page apiece. Now they were leaning back at ease, reading and smoking. When the violin began to play, they pricked up their ears, got their feet, and went on tiptoe to the hall, where they stood all together. Their movements must have been heard in the kitchen, for Gregor's father called out, "Is the violin playing disturbing you, gentlemen? It can be stopped at once." "On the contrary," said the middle lodger. "Could not Fraulein Samsa come and play in this room, besides us, but it is much more convenient and comfortable." "Oh, certainly," cried Gregor's father, as if he were the violin player. The lodgers came back into the living room and waited. Presently Gregor's father arrived with the music stand, his mother carrying the music, and his sister with the violin. His sister quietly made everything ready to start playing. His parents, who had never let rooms before and so had an exaggerated idea of the courtesy due to the lodgers, did not venture to sit down on their own chairs. His father leaned against the door, the right hand thrust between 2 buttons of his livery coat, which were formerly buttoned up. His mother offered a chair by one of the lodgers, and, since she left the chair just where it had happened to put it, sat down in the corner to one side. Gregor's sister began to play. The father and mother, from either side, intently watched the movements of her hand. Gregor, attracted by the playing, ventured to move forward a little until his head were actually inside the living room. You've had hardly any suppliers, its growing lack of consideration for the others. There had been a time when he prided himself on being considerate, yet just on this occasion he had more reason than ever to hide himself, as the turn of the amount of dust which lay thick in his room and rose to the air at the slightest movement. He too were covered with dust. Fluff and air and remnants of food trailed him, caught on his back and along his side. His indifference to everything was much too great for him to turn on his back and scrape himself clean on the carpet, as once he had done several times a day. In spite of his condition, no shame deterred him from advancing a little over the spotless floor of the living room. To be sure, no one were aware of him. The family were entirely absorbed in the violin playing. The lodgers, however, who first of all had stationed themselves, hands in pockets, much too close behind the music stand, so they could all have read the music, which must have bothered his sister, had soon retreated to the window, half whispering with down-bent heads, and stayed there while his father turned anxious eyes on them. Indeed, they were making it more obvious that they had been disappointed in their expectation of hearing good, enjoyable violin playing. They had had more than enough of the performance, and only out of courtesy suffered a continued disturbance of their peace. From the way they all kept blowing the smoke of their cigars high in the air, through nose and mouth, one could divine their irritation. And yet Gregor's sister were playing so beautifully. Her face leaned sideways, intently and sadly, her eyes followed the notes of music. Gregor crawled a little farther forward and lowered his head to the ground so that it might be possible for his eyes to meet hers. Were he an animal when music had such an effect on him? He felt as if the way were opening before him to the unknown nourishment he craved. He was determined to push forward till he reached his sister, to pull at her skirt, to let her know that she would come into his room with her violin. But no one here appreciated her playing as he would appreciate it. He would never let her out of his room, at least not so long as he lived. His frightful appearance would become for the first time useful to him. He would watch all the doors of his room at once and spit at intruders. But his sister should need no constraint. She should stay with him of her own free will. She should sit beside him on the sofa, bend down her ear to him, and hear him confide in him that he had the firm intention of sending her to the conservatorium, but for his mishap last Christmas, surely Christmas were long past, he would have announced it to everybody, without allowing a single objection. After this confession, his sister would be so touched that she would burst into tears, and Gregor would then raise himself to her shoulder and kiss her on the neck, which, now that she went to business, she kept 3 of any ribbon or collar. "Mr. Samsa!" cried the middle lodger to Gregor's father, and pointed without wasting any more words, as Gregor, now working himself slowly forwards. The violin fell silent. The middle lodger first smiled to his friend with a shake of the head, and then looked at Gregor again. Instead of dragging Gregor out, his father seemed to think it more needful to begin by soothing down the lodgers, though they were not at all agitated, and apparently found Gregor more entertaining than the violin playing. He hurried towards them, and, spreading out his arms, tried to urge them back into their own rooms, at the same time to block their view of Gregor. They now began to be really a little angry. One could not tell whether because of the odd man's little behaviour, or because it had just dawned on them that, and all unwittingly, they had such a neighbour as Gregor next door. They demanded explanations of his father. They waved their arms like him, tugged uneasily at their beards, and with only reluctance back towards their room. Meanwhile, Gregor's sister, who stood there as if lost with her playing, was so abruptly broken off, she come to life again, pulled herself together all at once after standing for a while holding the violin and bow in her nerveless hanging hands, and staring at her music, pushed the violin into the lap of her mother, who was still sitting in her chair, fighting asthmatically for breath, and ran into the lodger's room to which they were now being shepherded by her father, rather more quickly than before. One could see the pillows and blankets on the beds flying under her accustomed fingers, and being laid in order. Before the lodgers had actually reached their rooms, she had finished making their beds and slipped out. The old man seemed once more to be so possessed by his mulish self-assertiveness that he was forgetting all the respect he should show to his lodgers. He kept driving them on until the very door of the bedroom, the middle lodger stamped his foot loudly on the floor, and so brought them to a halt. "I beg to announce," said the lodger, lifting one hand and looking also at Gregor's mother, "that because of the disgusting conditions prevailing in this household and family," here he spat on the floor with emphatic brevity, "I give you notice on the spot. Naturally, I won't play you a penny, not even for the days I have lived here. On the contrary, I should consider bringing action for the damages against you based on claims, believe me, that will easily be susceptible of proof." He ceased and stared straight in front of him, as if he expected something. Whereat his 2 friends at once rushed into the breach with these words, "And we too, we give notice on the spot." On that he seized the door handle and shut the door with a slam. Gregor's father, groping with his hands, staggered forward and fell into his chair. It looked as if he were stretching himself there for an ordinary evening nap. But the marked jerking of his head, which was if uncontrollable, showed that he were far from asleep. Gregor had simply stayed still quietly all the time on the spot where the lodger had espied him. Disappointment at the failure of his plan, perhaps also the weakness arising from extreme hunger, made it impossible for him to move. He feared with a fair degree of certainty that at any moment the general tension would discharge itself in a combined attack upon him, and he lay waiting. He did not react even to the noise made by the violin as it fell off his mother's lap from under her trembling fingers and gave out a resonant note. "My dear parents," said his sister, slapping her hand on the table by way of introduction, "things can't go on like this. Perhaps you don't realise that, but I do. I won't utter my brother's name in the presence of this creature, and so all I say is we must try to get rid of it. We've tried to look after it and put up with it as far as is humanly possible, and I don't think anyone could reproach us in the slightest." "She's more than right," said Gregor's father to himself. His mother, who was still choking for lack of breath, began to cough hollowly into her hand, with a wild look in her eyes. His sister rushed over to her and held her forehead. His father's thoughts seemed to have lost their vagueness, as Greta's words. He sat more upright, fingering his service cap that lay among the plates still lying on the table from the lodger's supper, and from time to time looked at the still form of Gregor. "We must try to get rid of it," his sister now said explicitly to her father, since her mother were coughing up too much to hear a word. "It will be the death of both of you, I can see that coming. When one has to work as hard as we all do, one can't stand this continual torment at home on top of it. At least I can't stand it any longer." And she burst into such a passion of sobbing that the tears dropped in his mother's face, as she wiped them off mechanically. "My dear," said the old man sympathetically and with evident understanding, "but what can we do?" Gregor's sister merely shrugged her shoulders to indicate their feeling of helplessness that had now overmastered her during their weeping fit, in contrast to her former confidence. "If he could understand us," said her father half questioningly. Greta, still sobbing, vehemently waved her hand to show how unthinkable it was. "If he could understand us," repeated the old man, shutting his eyes to consider his daughter's conviction that the understanding were impossible, "and perhaps we might come to some agreement with him, but as it is—" "You must go," cried Gregor's sister. "That's the only solution, father. You must try to get rid of the idea that this is Gregor. The fact that we've believed it all so long is the root of all our trouble. But how can it be Gregor? If this were Gregor, he would have realised long ago that the human beings can't live with such a creature, and he'd have gone away of his own accord. Then we wouldn't have any brother, but we'd be able to go on living, keep his memory and honour. As it is, this creature persecutes us, drives away our lodgers, obviously wants the whole apartment to himself, and would have us all asleep in the gutter. Just look, father," she shrieked all at once. "He's at it again." In an access of panic that was quite incomprehensible to Gregor, she even quitted her mother, literally thrusting the chair from her as if she would rather sacrifice her mother than stay so near to Gregor, and rushed behind her father, who also rose up, being simply upset by her agitation, and half spread his arms as if to protect her. Yet Gregor had not the slightest intention of frightening anyone, far less his sister. He'd only be able to turn around in order to crawl back to his room, but it was certainly a startling operation to watch, since, because of his disabled condition, he could not execute the difficult turning movements, except by lifting his head and then bracing it against the floor, over and over again. He paused and looked round. His good intentions seemed to have been recognised. The alarm had only been momentary. Now they were watching him in melancholy silence. His mother lay in her chair, her legs stiffly outstretched and pressed together, her eyes almost closing from sheer weariness. His father and his sister were sitting beside each other, his sister's arms round the old man's neck. "Perhaps I can go on turning round now," thought Gregor, and began his labours again. He could not stop himself from panting with the effort, and he had to pause now and then to take breath. Nor did anyone harass him. He was left entirely to himself. When he had completed the turnaround, he began at once to pull straight back. He was amazed at the distance separating him from his rooms, and could not understand how, in his weak state, he had managed to accomplish the same journey so recently, almost without remarking it. Intent on crawling as fast as possible, he barely noticed that not a single word, not an ejaculation from his family, interfered with his progress. Only when he was already at the doorway did he turn his head round, not completely, for his neck muscles were getting stiff, but enough to see that nothing had changed behind him except that his sister had risen to her feet. His last glance fell on his mother, who was now quite overcome by sleep. Hardly were he well inside his room when the door was hastily pushed shut, bolted and locked. The sudden noise in his rear startled him so much that the little legs gave beneath him. Ooh. "Hey! Thank you very kindly, Tenor. You are my first subscriber, and I appreciate that greatly. You now have access to all of my funny emotes, which I hope will be of great use to you. Although, actually, technically, I don't think you can use them until I'm an affiliate. So actually, I guess you have access to all my funny emotes while you're here. But thank you kindly, I really appreciate it. Wow, Tanner, you were always the... You're not there. I'm very happy for you to have joined me, Tanner, and I'm very appreciative of it. What am I saying? You're very, very kind of me. Ooh, what are we doing? Alright, yeah. Back to it. Sudden noises rear startled him so much that his little legs gave out beneath him. It was his sister had shown such haste. She had been standing ready, waiting, and had made a light spring towards. Gregor had never even heard her coming, and she cried, "At last," to her parents as she turned the key in the lock. "And what now?" said Gregor to himself, looking round in the darkness. Soon he made the discovery that we were now unable to stir a limb. This did not surprise him. Rather, it seemed unnatural that he should ever actually have been able to move these feeble little legs. Otherwise, he felt relatively comfortable. True, his whole body were aching, but it seemed that the pain would gradually growing less, and would finally pass away. Right on apple in his back.
Thank you, but I dearly wish it weren't cheese.
Hey! Yeah, thank you for the
celebratory bits. Let's hear that alert now.
Yeah, thank you kindly, Tanner. Yeah, there's a bit of delay, but yeah. Every time you give me a bit, Lamp promises me a crumb of a slightly different and better sort of cheese than the normal cheese he gives me. So I'm very appreciative for you giving me these bits. Thank you very kindly. Otherwise, he felt relatively comfortable. True, his whole body were aching, but it seemed that the pain would gradually grow less and would finally pass away. He got an apple in his back, and the inflamed path around it, all covered with soft dust, already hardly troubled him. He thought of his family with tenderness and love. The decision that he must disappear was one that he held to even more strongly than his sister, if that were possible in. In this state of vacant and peaceful meditation he remained until the tower clock struck 3 in the morning. The first broadening of light in the world outside the window entered his consciousness once more. Then his head sunk to the floor of its own accord, and from his nostrils came the last faint flicker of his breath. When the charwoman arrived early in the morning, what between her strength and her impatience, she slammed all the doors so loudly, never mind how often she'd be begged to not do so, that no one in the whole apartment could enjoy any quiet sleep after her arrival. She noticed nothing unusual as she took her customary peep into Gregor's room. She thought he was lying motionless on purpose, pretending to be in the sulks. She credited him with every kind of intelligence. Since she happened to have the long-handled broom in her hand, she tried to tickle him with it from the doorway. When that too produced no reaction, she felt provoked and poked at him a little harder, and only when she had pushed him along the floor without meeting any resistance were her attention aroused. It did not take her long to establish the truth of the matter, and her eyes widened. She let out a whistle. He did not waste much time over it, but tore open the door of the Samson's bedroom and yelled into the darkness at the top of her voice, "Just look at this! It's dead! It's lying here dead and done for!" Mr. and Mrs. Samson started up in their double bed, and before they realised the nature of the child's announcement, had some difficulty in overcoming the shock of it. But then they got out of bed quickly, on either side, Mr. Samson throwing a blanket over his shoulder, Mrs. Samson in nothing but her nightgown. In this array they entered Gregor's room. Meanwhile the door of the living room opened too, and Greta had been sleeping since the advent of the lodgers. She was completely dressed as if she had not been to bed, which seemed to be confirmed also by the paleness of her face. "Dead?" said Mrs. Samson, looking questioningly at the charwoman. Though she could have investigated it for herself, the fact were obvious enough without investigation. "I should say so," said the charwoman, proving her words by pushing Gregor's corpse a long way to one side with her broomstick. Mrs. Samson made a movement as to stop her, but checked her. "Well," said Mrs. Samson, "now thanks be to God." Oh no, sorry, that was Mr. "Well," said Mr. Samson, "now thanks be to God." He crossed himself, and the 3 women followed his example. Greta, whose eyes never left the corpse, said, "Just see how thin he was. It's been such a long time since he's eaten anything. The food came out again just as it went in." Indeed, Gregor's body was completely flat and dry, as could only now be seen where it were no longer supported by the legs, and nothing prevented one from looking closely at it. "Come in beside us, Greta, for a little while," said Miss Samson with a tremulous smile, and Greta, not without looking back at the corpse, followed her parents into the bedroom. The charwoman shut the door and opened the window wide. Though it was so early in the morning, a certain softness was perceptible in the fresh air. After all, we were already toward the end of March. The 3 lodgers emerged from their room and were surprised to see no breakfast. They had been forgotten. "Where's our breakfast?" said the middle lodger peevishly to the charwoman. She put her fingers to her lips hastily, without a word, indicated by gestures that they should go into Gregor's room. They did so and stood, their hands in the pockets of their somewhat shabby coats, around Gregor's corpse in the room where it was now fully lit. At that, the door of the Samsers' bedroom opened, and Mr. Samser appeared in his uniform, his wife on one arm, his daughter on the other. They all looked a little as if they had been crying. From time to time, Greta hid her face in her father's arm. "Leave my house at once," said Mr. Samson, pointing to the door without disengaging himself from the woman. "What do you mean by that?" The middle lodger had taken somewhat aback with a feeble smile. The two others put their hands behind them and kept rubbing them together, as if in gleeful expectation of a fine set to, which they were bound to come off the winners. "I mean just what I say," answered Mr. Samson, advancing in a straight line with his two companions towards the lodger. He stood his ground, at first quietly, looking at the floor, as if his thoughts were taking a new pattern in his head. "And let us go by all means," he said, and looked up at Mr. Samsa, as if in a sudden access of humility he were expecting some renewed sanction for this decision. Mr. Samsa merely nodded briefly once or twice with meaning eyes. Upon that, the lodger really did go, with her long strides into the hall. His two friends had been listening and had quite stopped rubbing their hands for some moments now, one scuttling after him as if afraid that Mr. Samsa might get into the hall before them and cut them off from their leader. In the hall, they all three took their hats from the rack, their sticks from the umbrella stand, bowed in silence, and quitted the apartment. With suspiciousness, which proved quite unfounded, Mr. Samsa and the two women followed them out into the landing. Leaning over the banisters, they watched the three figures slowly but surely going down the long stairs, vanishing from sight at a certain turn of the staircase on every floor, and coming back into view again after a moment or so. The more they dwindled, the more the Samsa family's interest in them dwindled. When a butcher's boy met them and passed them on the stairs, coming up proudly with a tray on his head, Mr. Samsa and the two women soon left the landing, as if the burden had been lifted from them, and went back into their apartment. They decided to spend the day in resting and going for a stroll. They had not only deserved such a respite from work, but absolutely needed it. And so they sat down at the table and wrote 3 notes of excuse, Mr. Samsa to his board of management, Mrs. Samsa to her employer, and Greta to the head of her firm. While they were writing, the child came in to say that she was going now, since her morning's work was finished. At first they only nodded without looking up, but she kept over and over them, they eyed her irritably. "Well," said Mr. Samsa. The charwoman stood grinningly in the doorway, as if she had good news to impart to the family, but meant not to say a word unless properly questioned. A small ostrich feather standing upright on her hat, which had annoyed Mr. Samsa ever since she were engaged, were waving gaily in all directions. "Well, what is it then?" asked Mrs. Samsa, who obtained more respect from the charwoman than the others. "Oh," said the charwoman, giggling so amiably that she couldn't not at once continue. "Just this, you don't need to bother about how to get rid of that thing next door. It's been seen to already." Mrs. Samsa and Greta bent over the letters again, as if preoccupied. Mr. Samsa, who perceived that she were eager to begin describing in detail, stopped with a decisive hand. But she were not allowed to tell her story. She remembered the great hurry she were in, being obviously deeply off. "Bye-bye, everybody," she said, rolling off violently in the palm with a frightful slamming of the door. "She'll be given notice tonight," said Mr. Samsa, but neither his wife nor his daughter did he get any answer. But the charwoman seemed to have shattered again the composure they had barely achieved. They rose, went to the window, and stayed there, clasping each other tight. Mr. Samsa turned in his chair to look at them and quietly observed them for a little. Then he called out, "Come along now, do. Let bygones be bygones. You might have some consideration for me." The two of them complied at once, hastened to him, caressed him, and quickly finished their letters. Then they all three left the apartment together, which were more than they had done for months, and went by tram into the open country outside the town. The tram, in which they were the only passenger, were filled with warm sunshine. Leaning comfortably back in their seats, they canvassed the prospects for the future. It appeared on closer inspection that these were not all bad. The jobs they had got, which so far they had never really discussed with each other, were all three admirable, and likely to lead to better things later on. The greatest immediate improvement in their condition would of course arise from moving to another house. They wanted to take a smaller and cheaper, but also better suited and more easily run apartment than the one they had, which Gregor had selected. While they were conversing, it struck both Mr. and Mrs. Samsa almost at the same moment. They became aware of their daughter's increasing vivacity, that in spite of all the stories of recent times, which had made her cheeks pale, she had bloomed into a pretty girl with a good figure. They grew quieter and half unconsciously exchanged glances of complete agreement, having come to the conclusion that it would soon be time to find a good husband for her. They were like a confirmation of the new dreams and excellent intentions that at the end of their journey their daughter sprang to her feet first and stretched her young body. That's the end of Metamorphosis. Let me have a quick drink to wet my throat, and then we'll do a little bit of literary analysis for the evening. We may as well do it somewhere comfortable. So, let's do the last chapter first and then our overall. So, as we see, Gregor Samsa is, as is common with VTubers, quite a sickly figure, and he succumbs to the apple wound from the prior chapter and dies, but not before expressing a great interest in art and music, which is also quite a common trait of VTubers. What else? The family takes in lodgers as a way to try and make up for the lost income, and begin dumping things in his room, which, I don't know, I wonder if that's sort of a compulsion on their part. The idea that a VTuber's room should be a disgusting place being a natural component, or if he in some way unconsciously signals to them that they should be doing it. I don't know. Or maybe it's just the charwoman. She seems to better understand him than the family, so maybe she's familiar with VTubers in the rest of her life. Yeah, I mean, overall, let's see. I mean, it's quite a sad story, really. Gregor Samsa, who sort of defines himself by the work he does and the benefit he brings to his family, becomes, I mean, essentially disabled, right? Unable to function in society. People look down on him and disgust him, and his family looks down on him too. They're cruel to him, even though they don't mean to be, or don't want to be, and they love him initially, but as he becomes more of a burden to them, his VTuber form not able to be useful for them as before, and they all have to work and they find them some strain. I mean, you see the realities of poverty and the way that they can affect the people, and the way that they can lead one to be cruel to a relative who was disabled, especially a relative who used to be an owner. And what with Gregor Samsa's his alteration being quite an unusual one, VTubers seemingly being little understood at the time, they're crueler to him than even they would normally be. And so you see this sort of this man who has nothing but good traits, who seems to do nothing but care for his family and want the best for them, to love music, to be losing himself. You see him discarded and hated and cruelly treated, and yet at the same time you can't really fault the family for it. Even though their actions are cruel, even though what they do to him, what happens to him, is unfair, you can understand their perspective as well. That's the thing, that's the nature of the tragedy. No one is in the wrong, no one is wicked, no one is hateful or evil, they just don't understand. And they're all suffering as well, though perhaps not as much as him. And so he slowly wastes away and dies, and in the end it's the best thing for all of them, which is terribly sad. But oh dear, it seems like things are starting to fall apart again. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I can see. Oh dear. Yeah, I'm starting to think we might be having technical issues here, but yeah. I mean, I can see why it's famous. It's a very good book. And I mean, I can imagine it's an early account of the phenomenon of people turning into giant animals before the whole VTubing thing was sort of established. And it does a really good job of exploring the themes of alienation, of disability, of the mundane horrors of day-to-day life, and the small cruelties of them. And I could go on at a bit more length, but I do think I'm in some danger of crashing on account of how things seem to be flickering and dying on me. I think I briefly disappeared there for a moment. So yeah, rather than take a moment to reflect more on this seminal work, I'm sure, on the nature of people turning into giant animals and becoming VTubers, I think I'll have to call it there. It's a shame, because it was a really good book and it deserves more consideration. Yeah, I do agree with you, Tanner. It's strange, really, how VTubers seem to arise sort of before the advent of streaming media, almost as though they sort of predicted it somehow. Almost makes one believe in a preordination by a divine being. But yeah, I think I'm going to have to call this here before we start crashing. Let's see if there's anyone online already. Nope, I've got that one. So, which might be for the best, given that I don't know how well it would hold up. So, I'm going to call it here. I do thank you everyone for stopping by. I thank you especially, Tanner, for subscribing. It's very kind of you. You're more than welcome for me streaming. I did really enjoy this one. I'm hopeful that well, hopefully soon the lamp will stop burning all the extra oil and it won't be so hot in there, and I can stream a bit more reliably. But yeah, I enjoyed that, and we've got a few more Kafkas, so we might do some more of it in the future. But yeah, what am I supposed to do? Oh yeah, thank you everyone, thank you Tanner for subscribing, thank you everyone for being here. This Sunday we're doing Fugi Theatre with a bunch of people. With Discipline Plague, Layla and Avriz, we'll be doing some live theatre, so that'll be nice. They'll all be, I think they're all planning to stream it too, but we'll find out. I do hope you'll stop by for that. It should be a good time, and you're more than welcome out there. Thank you for stopping by as well. I genuinely appreciate everyone who does stop by. It's always good to have company. But yeah, but things are flickering more and more, and the wards do seem to be destabilising. So I had better go and do something about that before everything falls apart and more bad things get in. So thank you very much everyone for being here. I do genuinely appreciate all of you. And until next time, ta-ra!